Imagine finding a cake of fat, buried in the ground, still edible after ice ages had come and gone. Now imagine it wasn't an accident. Someone made it that way, on purpose, thousands of generations before refrigeration existed. That's not survival by luck. That's a supply chain. We tend to picture Ice Age humans as living meal to meal, hunting today and starving by next week. But the deeper you dig into the archaeological record, the more that picture falls apart. These people weren't just eating. They were processing, preserving, and stockpiling food with a level of intention that looks almost industrial. What did they actually keep? And how did they keep it from rotting in a world with no glass, no plastic, and no electricity? That's what we're unpacking today. Let's start with something that sounds almost unbelievable. At a site called Neumark-Nord in Germany, researchers found the smashed remains of at least 172 large mammals, all broken down at a single dedicated location. Not scattered kills, not casual butchering. A repeated operation, done over and over, in one place, going back roughly 125,000 years. That's nearly 100,000 years earlier than anyone assumed organized food processing began. What were they doing with all those bones? They were rendering fat. Here's the method, and it's smarter than it sounds. Crush the spongy bone into fragments. Drop it into a pit lined with hide, add water, then heat stones in a fire and drop those in too. The fat rises to the surface. You skim it off. Once it cools, it hardens into a dense block, something you could carry, store, and ration out over weeks. It's essentially a Pleistocene energy bar. No fridge required. Just chemistry, patience, and a plan. And this wasn't the only trick for banking calories. At Qesem Cave in Israel, a site dated up to 420,000 years old, the evidence tells a different but related story. Bones there were left intact, still wrapped in skin and tendon, for weeks after the animal was killed. That covering acted like natural packaging. It slowed spoilage just enough that the marrow inside stayed usable long after the kill. In other words, they weren't eating everything at once. They were letting the carcass function as a pantry, waiting to be cracked open when it was needed. Why rush a meal when you can delay it on purpose? This idea of deliberate aging shows up again much later and much farther north. Across the Arctic, indigenous communities built underground cellars known by different names depending on the group: Lednik, Ka'adaran, Sewjwak, Siklugak. And here's the part that surprises people. These weren't just cold boxes to stop decay. They were used to intentionally ferment meat and fish, letting time and bacteria do controlled, purposeful work on the food. Some of these practices trace back into deep prehistory. Some are still used today. The freezer wasn't just a freezer. It was a fermentation chamber with a lid made of permafrost. Storage wasn't the only organized behavior happening around food. At Ohalo 2, a 23,000-year-old campsite on the Sea of Galilee, archaeologists uncovered a brush hut with distinct activity zones inside it. One section held a grinding stone, used to process wild wheat, barley, and oats, roughly 8,000 years before farming as we know it even existed. A separate section was dedicated to flint knapping. Different tasks, different spaces, possibly divided along gender lines. That's not chaos. That's logistics. People were organizing labor around food production millennia before anyone planted a seed on purpose. And sometimes the storage system was the architecture itself. At Kostenki 11 in Russia, researchers have documented massive circular structures built from dozens of mammoth bones. For a long time, these were assumed to be simple shelters. But the emerging picture is more interesting. Part of their function may have been to butcher carcasses on site, right next to natural permafrost, effectively turning the whole structure into a combined slaughterhouse and cold storage unit. Build the walls out of the animal. Store the meat a few steps away. Everything within reach, all season long. Now, here's where we need to pause and correct something, because one of the most repeated stories about Ice Age food is actually false. You've probably heard the tale of the Explorers Club banquet in 1951, where scientists supposedly dined on preserved mammoth meat recovered from the ice. It's a great story. It's been retold for decades. It's also a hoax. When researchers finally ran DNA analysis on a preserved sample of that meat, it didn't match mammoth or ground sloth at all. It turned out to be green sea turtle. The whole legend was built on nothing. But here's the twist. A real version of that story does exist, and it happened in 1979. A team led by biologist Dale Guthrie actually cooked and ate meat from Blue Babe, a 36,000-year-old steppe bison mummy discovered frozen near Fairbanks, Alaska. They simmered it in a stew with vegetables. The verdict? Tough, but genuinely edible, with what Guthrie himself described as a strong Pleistocene aroma, so the fake story got the fame. The real one actually happened, and almost nobody's heard of it. which raises an obvious question. If the meat survives that long, could you actually eat frozen mammoth fat today if you found some? Mostly, no. And the reason is strange. Forensic scientists have found that fat preserved in permafrost for tens of thousands of years doesn't just sit there unchanged. It slowly converts into something called adipocere, a soap-like, cottage cheese-textured substance. It's the same transformation seen in human remains decomposed in cold, wet conditions. So that perfectly preserved mammoth you've seen in documentaries? Preserved, yes. Edible, not really. Chemistry had other plans. Cold wasn't even the only preservation method available. Some researchers believe early humans understood a completely different principle, one you'd recognize instantly if you've ever felt a wet towel go cold in the wind. Wrap food in a wetted animal hide. As the moisture evaporates, it pulls heat away from whatever is inside. It's evaporative cooling, the same basic principle still used today in pot-and-pot refrigeration systems in desert regions with no electricity, no ice required. Just water, air, and physics, deployed by people with no word for either. Stack all of this together, and a very different picture starts to form. Bone grease rendered into transportable fat blocks. Marrow banked inside its own natural wrapping. Meat and fish deliberately fermented in underground cellars. Grain processed at dedicated stations. Mammoth bone structures doubling as cold storage. Wet hides pulling heat out of food through evaporation alone. None of this is improvised. None of it is lucky. This is a species already thinking in terms of surplus, timing, and shelf life. Tens of thousands of years before anyone wrote a single word down. We like to imagine progress as a straight line, with refrigeration and food science as recent inventions built entirely from scratch. But the instinct underneath all of it, the drive to make food last longer than the moment it was caught, is ancient. It was already running in caves in Israel 400,000 years ago. It was already running in Germany 125,000 years ago. It never really stopped. Every fridge in every kitchen today is just a more polished version of a hide-lined pit, a permafrost cellar, a bone grease cake cooling in the dark. So the next time you close a refrigerator door or vacuum seal something to make it last, remember what you're actually doing. You're not doing anything new. You're doing the oldest trick your species ever learned, the one that let a handful of humans outlast winters they had no business surviving. And somewhere back across all those thousands of years, that fat cake buried in the ground wasn't luck at all. It was the plan working exactly as intended.